This story is titled, The Party That Shattered Us. A birthday party I wasn't invited to, but what followed was far worse. A web of secrets, a double life, and a war that tore my family apart forever. Some bonds, I learned, are better broken. Dad's 50th birthday was coming up, and the way he talked about it, you'd think it was the event of the decade. He'd mentioned it months in advance, hinting at a big party, a fancy restaurant, and a long guest list. I knew better than to get my hopes up when it came to him, but I figured I'd be invited anyway. Not because we were close, we weren't, but because I was his son. A week before the party, I decided to give him a call. If nothing else, I wanted to ask what he wanted as a gift. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but I thought showing some goodwill might bridge the gap between us, at least a little. He picked up after a few rings, and after some small talk, I asked, "What would you like for your birthday?" He laughed, a deep, mocking laugh. I remember how the sound of it made my stomach clench. "What makes you think I'm inviting you?" I thought. I'd misheard. There was silence on my end, waiting for him to continue, to say he was joking. He wasn't. "Only people close to me will be there, Nathan, and we are not close. You're a burden your mother left behind. Go to her abroad and work with her. There." I don't even know what shocked me more, the words themselves or the way he said them, so casually, so amused, as if he were dismissing an annoying stranger rather than his own son. I clenched my phone, trying to process. I could have argued, demanded an explanation, but what would have been the point? I swallowed my pride, took a slow breath, and said, "Fine." Then I hung up. I don't know if I expected him to call, back, or text, but he didn't. I sat with the silence for a long time before deciding I wasn't going to let it get to me. If that was his choice, fine. I had bigger things to focus on. But the next day, my uncle, my mother's brother, called me. He'd been at the party, and what he told me made things worse. That's when things started to unravel. The morning after the party, my phone rang. It was my uncle, my mother's brother. He wasn't the kind of guy to call just to chat, and when I picked up, there wasn't even a hello. Just his voice, deep and serious. "Nathan, you won't believe what I saw last night." I rubbed my face, already knowing this wasn't going to be good. "Go on," he sighed. "Your dad, that party was something else, and not in a good way." My uncle had been invited, probably because my dad didn't expect him to care too much. He was family, but he wasn't the type to cause drama, so my dad must have thought he was safe. Big mistake. The party was at a ridiculously expensive restaurant. One of those places where the bill for a small dinner can make your bank account cry. My dad had spared no expense. Private dining room, live music, open bar. The guests were all laughing, drinking, toasting what a great man he was. But my uncle noticed something strange almost immediately. My father wasn't just surrounded by old friends and family. Right next to him, practically glued to his side, were two women who clearly didn't belong there. One was his secretary, Emily, a woman in her late 20s who had always been a little too comfortable around him. The other, a woman from his office, mid-30s, overdressed, the kind of person you could just tell thrived on attention. It wasn't just casual conversation. My dad had his hands on them all night, resting on their hips, whispering in their ears, running his fingers down their arms. He grinned like he'd won the lottery, completely unconcerned that half the people in the room knew he was still married. At first, my uncle tried to tell himself that maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe it was just flirting, just an old man trying to impress younger women. Embarrassing, but not exactly damning. But then he overheard something that made his stomach turn. One of my dad's friends, a guy he'd known for years, leaned over with a grin. "So, which one is your favorite?" And my dad, without missing a beat, laughed. "Why choose?" That was when my uncle knew this wasn't just harmless fun. This was something worse. He sat through the rest of the night, watching my dad get drunker and bolder, touching them more openly, ignoring everyone else. As the party began to wind down, it was obvious what was going to happen next. When most of the guests left, my father didn't go home alone. He left with the two women, and my uncle, already angry, decided to follow him. He stayed behind, making sure my dad didn't notice him, and watched as he drove to a small house. Not our family home, but a one-story place in a quieter part of town. My uncle parked down the street and waited. 20 minutes passed. Curiosity got the better of him, and he got out of the car and walked closer. The lights were on inside, but the curtains weren't completely closed. My uncle only had to take a few steps before he saw exactly what was going on, and what he saw made his blood boil. My uncle wasn't the kind of man to get involved in drama. He'd always been the quiet observer, the one who stood on the sidelines and let people dig their own graves. But that night, as he stood outside that little house watching my father through a crack in the curtains, something inside him snapped. He hadn't intended to spy at first. He just wanted to see where my father was going. Maybe he'd convinced. Himself, he needed proof, or maybe he just couldn't look away. But as he got closer, as he saw the scene unfolding inside, it was no longer about curiosity. It was about disgust. Inside, my father sat on the couch with a drink in one hand, and his secretary, Emily, draped over him like a prize he'd won. The other woman, the one from his office, was sitting next to them, laughing at something he'd said. The three of them looked comfortable. Too comfortable. It was clear this wasn't the first time they'd done this. At first, my uncle thought maybe they were just drinking, just being inappropriate. But then my dad pulled Emily onto, his lap, his hands on her waist, and whispered something in her ear. She giggled, tilting her head back as the other woman leaned closer, running a hand down his arm. My uncle's stomach turned. This was where my mother's money went. The same money she'd sent home to help with the bills, to build their future, to save for the house my father had said they desperately needed. He'd never planned to use it for a house. He'd never planned to use it for anything but this, his double life, his secret playground, his disgusting little routine, while my mother worked herself to exhaustion in another country. And that's when my uncle knew this wasn't just cheating. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a man who had already decided that his family didn't matter. My uncle clenched his fists and breathed heavily. Every instinct told him to go inside, to grab my father by the collar and drag him out into the street. But he didn't. Not yet. Because this wasn't his fight. This was my mom's. So he turned around, went back to his car, and drove home. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he picked up the phone, and when my mother answered, he told her everything. The next day, she got on a plane, and my dad had no idea what he was in for. My mother didn't ask many questions when my uncle told her what he'd seen. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, at least not on the phone. She just got quiet. Too quiet. Then she said, "I'll take care of it." She was on a plane the next morning. She didn't tell my dad she was coming. She didn't even tell me. I only found out when I got a call from my uncle, his voice a mix of excitement and anger. "She's here," he said. It took me a second to process. "Who?" "Your mom. She just landed. I hadn't seen her for almost 6 months. She'd been working abroad, saving money, planning for a future she didn't know was a lie. And now, instead of coming home to a warm reunion, she was coming home to war." I didn't know what she had planned, but I knew my father wasn't ready for it. My uncle picked her up at the airport, and the two of them went straight to my dad's house, not the family house, the other house. I got there as fast as I could and parked a few houses away. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but I knew it wasn't going to be pretty. By the time I got there, my mom was already inside. I could hear her even before I walked through the door. "What is this?" Her voice cut through the walls, sharp and angry. I stepped inside just in time to see my father scramble off the couch, still in his robe, his hair disheveled, as if he'd just woken up. The two women, his secretary and the other one, were sitting there, stunned, wrapped in blankets. They had no idea what had happened, but my father did. His face went pale the moment he saw my mother standing there, suitcase still in hand, eyes blazing with rage. "What are you doing here?" he stammered, trying to pull his robe tighter. She dropped the suitcase. "What am I doing here? Are you serious?" She turned and pointed at the two women. "Maybe you should ask them." Emily, the secretary, stood up, still holding the blanket around her shoulders. Maybe we should—" My mother cut her off. "Sit down." And she did. I had never seen my mom like this. She was always the one who kept her cool, always the one who avoided unnecessary fights. But this wasn't unnecessary. She turned back to my father. "I want my money, every single cent." He let out a nervous chuckle. "What money?" Before he could even react, my mom stormed past him, heading straight for the bedroom. He tried to block her, but she pushed him aside as if he weighed nothing. I followed, too stunned to do anything but watch. She ripped open drawers, pulled open cabinets, and within seconds, she found it. The stash of cash he'd been keeping. Thousands of dollars, money she'd sent home. She took it all. He finally snapped out of his shock. "Hey, you can't just take that." She turned to face him, holding the thick stack of bills. "Oh, I can't?" Then she slapped the money across his chest, hard. "You lived off my money, my work, my effort, while you sit here drinking and screwing your little office pets." She took a step closer, her voice deeper now, more dangerous. "You think I don't know what you've been doing?" He swallowed, hard, his eyes darting between her and the money he still held in his hands. Then she said the words that knocked the last bit of air out of him. "You're done, Richard. I'm divorcing you. And you're out of this house." His mouth opened and closed, as if he wanted to argue, as if he wanted to defend himself. But there was nothing to say. Because she wasn't bluffing, she turned, grabbed her suitcase, and walked out. And just like that, my dad's world, his perfect little secret life, came crashing down. But he wasn't going down without a fight, and that's when things got really ugly. My dad stood there, clutching the pile of money like it could somehow save him. The two women on the couch were still wrapped in blankets, staring as if they'd just realized they were in the middle of a disaster they wanted no part of. Then, as if waking from a trance, my father snapped. He lunged at my mother and grabbed her wrist. "You can't just take my money and kick me out of my own house." My uncle jumped him before I had a chance. He pushed my dad back so hard he almost tripped over the coffee table. "Your house?" My uncle's voice was deadly calm. "This house was bought with her money. It's in her name. You're the one leaving." Dad's face twisted. "You don't get to tell me that. Go! Out!" Mom cut him off. Dad looked between the three of us, his son, his brother-in-law, and the woman he'd betrayed. His confidence cracked. "You're overreacting," he tried, his tone now desperate. "It's not what it looks like, okay? They're just friends. We had a drink, that's all." Emily, the secretary, actually scoffed. The other woman just sank deeper into the couch as if to disappear. My mother let out a laugh, but it wasn't amused. "Right, just drinking. Is that why my brother saw you bringing them here at 2 in the morning?" Dad stammered. He followed me?" "Of course I did," my uncle snapped. "You think I was just going to sit there while you humiliated my sister?" My father's eyes darted back to me. I hadn't said a word. Maybe he thought I'd take his side. Maybe he thought I'd defend him. I didn't. Instead, I finally spoke. "Why didn't you just tell me you didn't want the family?" Silence. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because we all knew the answer. He had a family. He just didn't care enough to keep them. Mother didn't wait for another excuse. She turned on her heel and walked out. My uncle followed. I lingered for a second, watching my father stand there, helpless, pathetic, completely caught up in the mess he'd made. Then I walked out too. We thought that was the end of it. We thought he'd accept it and move on. We were wrong. Because the next day, my dad decided that if his life was falling apart, he was going to make mine a living hell. I should have known my dad wouldn't go down quietly. A man like him, selfish, arrogant, convinced he was untouchable, would never accept defeat. The very next morning, he began his retaliation. It started with a phone call. I was at home, still processing everything from the night before, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. A smug voice greeted me. "Hey, Nathan, guess what?" It was my dad. I didn't say anything. I just waited. "You think you and your mom can just kick me out and get away with it?" He chuckled. "You have no idea what you're in for." I hung up. I wasn't in the mood for his games. A minute later, a text came through. "You'll regret this." I should have blocked him. I should have ignored it. But I didn't. Because, deep down, I knew he meant it. And I was right. An hour later, my landlord called. "Nathan, we have a problem. Your father just contacted us. He said you've been missing rent payments." I almost dropped my phone. "What? That's not true." I thought so. But he also said you've been causing a disturbance in the building. There's a formal complaint now. My blood ran cold. I'd lived in that apartment for over 2 years without a single problem. My father was lying. And worse, he was trying to get me evicted. I had to go down to the office and straighten everything out, proving that I'd paid every cent on time. Fortunately, my landlord believed me, but that was only the beginning. The next day, my boss called me into his office. "Nathan," he said carefully, "we received a very disturbing email about you." I frowned. "From who?" He turned his screen to me. The email was anonymous, but I knew exactly who it was from. It accused me of stealing from the company, said I was unreliable, a problem employee. There were even fake screenshots of messages I'd sent, trashing my boss. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "This is obviously fake," I said, keeping my voice calm. My boss sighed. "I figured as much, but you should know. Someone really wants to mess with you." I clenched my fists. "Dad," I got another text that night. "Think you're better than me? See how fast I can ruin you." That's when I decided I was done playing defense. If my dad wanted a war, he was going to get one. I sat in my apartment, phone in hand, staring at the last message my dad had sent. "You think you're better than me? Watch how fast I can ruin you." I should have been angry. I should have been stressed. But instead, I just felt tired. Tired of the games. Tired of the lies. Tired of a man who had done nothing but take from everyone around him. Then my doorbell rang. It was my mom. She stepped inside, calm but with that sharp focus in her eyes that told me she already knew everything. My uncle must have told her about my dad's little revenge attempts. "He tried to get you evicted?" she asked. "Yeah. And fired." I nodded. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. That's it. I didn't know what she meant at first, but then she pulled out her phone. I was going to wait until everything was finalized, but forget that, she said, dialing a number. I'm ending this now. I leaned forward. Who are you calling? She gave me a small smile. My lawyer. Within the hour, we were at her lawyer's office. She'd already filed for divorce, but she was accelerating the process. My dad had nothing under his name. Not the house, not the money, nothing. It had all been my mom's. And she'd finally decided to take back full control. She signed the last document, looked at the lawyer, and said, I want him out of my life for good. And just like that, it was done. The real show happened later, that night. We went back to the house, her house, and found my dad still there, sulking, probably thinking he could talk his way out of this. But when my mom walked in, she didn't say a word. She just tossed a stack of papers onto the table. He picked them up, confused. Then his face went pale. His voice cracked. You finalized it? She crossed her arms. I told you I would. He flipped through the pages, hands shaking. Then he looked up at her, desperation creeping into his eyes. You can't do this. She tilted her head. Says who? I already did. He turned to me. Nathan, you can't seriously be okay with this. I met his gaze and said the words he'd once said to me. What makes you think I care? His mouth opened, but nothing came out. For the first time in his life, my dad had nothing. No money. No home. No one left to manipulate, and I think that's when he realized it was over. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just packed a bag, walked out the door, and left. We never saw him again. No calls, no texts, no rumors of where he'd gone. It was like he'd disappeared off the face of the earth. And honestly, that was fine by me. My mom moved on. She kept the house, focused on her work, and never looked back. As for me, I finally stopped trying to be the son of a man who never deserved me in the first place. And for the first time in a long time, life felt peaceful.